So what I will say is what I've seen way too much of, and it does cause me very serious concern, is we're seeing people who had cancers that were in remission or that were being well controlled, and their cancers have gone completely out of control after getting the vaccine. And what we do know with the vaccine causes at least a temporary drop in T cell numbers, and those T cells are part of our immune system, and they're the critical weapons that our immune system has to fight off cancerous cells. So there's a potential mechanism there, and all I can say is I've had people contact me with way too many of these reports for me to feel comfortable. I do feel that's probably, I would say, my newest major safety concern, and it's also the one that is going to be by far the most underreported in any adverse event database, because if somebody's had a cancer before the vaccine, there's no way public health officials will ever link it to the vaccine. But what we're seeing is oncology teams that had pushed the cancers into remission or were keeping them well controlled can no longer control them after the vaccine. So we know in Canada, it's very upsetting, because in Canada, we have a system that will never detect problems with these vaccines. That's why we've always had to rely on other countries, like with the AstraZeneca vaccine. We told Canadians that the AstraZeneca vaccine was 100% safe, despite the fact that 12 European countries had paused the program to look for potential links to the blood clotting, potentially fatal blood clotting. And we were told as Canadians that we didn't have to worry, because ours was from they announced that the problem was associated with a single batch from a single production facility in Europe. The European Medicines and ours was coming from India, and therefore it didn't apply to us. The European Medicines Agency will tell you that was never the case. And of course, then eventually, after there were Canadians that did die, and many that did have to be treated for the blood clots, then we finally admitted that it was a problem. And that's how our system is never going to work, because this is the thing. First of all, we're not informing people when they get the vaccine that they're to report any unusual medical condition up to 8 weeks after receiving a dose of the vaccine, and the attending physician is and the attending physician is required by law to report anything unusual. Most physicians are not, and now many don't, because they don't want to contradict the current narrative. And the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario has turned out to be incredibly tyrannical and are crushing many physicians and threatening many who don't go with this narrow public health narrative. Many also can't get their submissions done because they're onerous. So, for example, in British Columbia, it can take up to 40 minutes to submit one of these reports. And you can imagine there's an emergency room physician who sees 5 people in a shift that come in with problems and have recently been vaccinated. They can't afford to spend hours on that shift reporting it, right? So there's many reasons, there's many reasons why people aren't reporting to the physicians, and there's many reasons why the physicians aren't reporting to the local medical officer of health. And that's the next step. Is if a physician submits it, it doesn't go into our database. It goes to the local medical officer of health. The local medical officer of health
check.
This is the thing. The physicians are not supposed to make a determination of whether they think the medical condition that's occurred after the vaccine is or is not related to the vaccine. They're not supposed to make that determination. The local medical officers of health are, and as you can imagine, with the huge bias that exists there, the majority of them, we're seeing unusually high percentages of these reports that do get submitted being rejected at the level of the local medical officer of health. And then from there, the ones that they do approve go to the Public Health Agency of Canada, and then they could be filed into our adverse event database. But because of all the filtering that's going on, this is the problem. We're not getting accurate numbers. So yes, a statistician, of course, could be looking for these, but if you don't get accurate numbers reported, you can do all the analysis you want. It's not going to be accurate, right? Your analysis is only as accurate as the data, the raw data you have to work with. The D-dimer test is definitely a good one to do because it can be suggestive of microclots, which could be an indicator of blood clotting. But yeah, we're finding that most physicians won't do it. And we're also finding a shortage, actually, of the blood collection tubes that are needed to do that as well. No, this is a virus, but ivermectin has clear-cut antiviral properties. So it can, for example, one of the mechanisms has multiple mechanisms of action, but one is it inhibits the binding of the spike protein on the virus to these receptors that we have on the cells of our lungs. And and what's interesting is a lot of countries, so that's what's frustrating for me. As a vaccine developer, I knew that there was going to be no outlet for the vaccines, and if if there were effective early treatment strategies. So I followed the science for the early treatment strategies, and I saw that the studies were flawed early on. For example, a lot of the studies that were being done in countries where things like ivermectin were available over the counter. So in other words, they were testing their treatment group, which was getting a defined amount of ivermectin, and comparing it to a control group, which had an undefined amount of ivermectin. So essentially comparing ivermectin treatment to ivermectin treatment, right? And then they showed there was no benefit. Well, of course not if you're comparing, a treatment group to a treatment group. And so when the science has been done properly, there's an overwhelming of scientific data showing that it works. And so even though I love vaccines, I couldn't help but wonder why we were providing initially this authorization for interim use, what we call emergency use in the United States, because we had clear, effective early treatments. I've worked with many physicians. These things clearly work. In fact, a lot of the countries that are having the most success, like, for example, a lot of the low-income countries have had no choice. I mean, you look, they've been left to take the leftovers for the vaccines. They can't afford a lot of expensive treatments, so they have been relying on these effective early treatment strategies using repurposed generic drugs that are really cheap, and they've had a huge success. So look, for example, Egypt is a good example. Egypt has a 3% vaccination rate. 3% of their eligible population is double vaccinated, compared to Canada, which is at around 64, 66%. And they have 14 cases of COVID-19 per 100,000 people per day on average, whereas we have about 570 cases per day. So vastly higher. And this is what people are seeing. A recent study came out looking at 68 different countries, and they plotted on a graph the case rate for COVID-19 and the vaccination rate in the country. And the more vaccinated the country is, the more problems they're having with COVID-19. And when you look at these countries that have low vaccination rates, they've been relying on effective early treatment strategies. So for example, with Egypt, I didn't realize, but I asked that question to my collaborators, what is Egypt doing right, that we're not doing here in North America? They sent me the official treatment protocol for COVID-19. Do you know what the number one thing is that they go to first is hydroxychloroquine, and number two is ivermectin.
Wow.
And if you look at Israel has the highest vaccination rate in the world, right? And the Delta variant is completely out of control, which is why they've been administering the third dose, why they've committed to a fourth dose. And with these numbers I was telling you, so they have the highest vaccination rate. So again, keep this in mind so to understand. Egypt, 3% vaccination rate, 14 cases per 100,000 of their population per day. Israel is at over an 80% vaccination rate and has over 5,000 cases right now per day. So these things work best as an early treatment strategy. So they should be administered. The sooner you administer them, the better the outcome. So we've had physicians, and I know these people, and they're good friends of mine, who have been absolutely destroyed for using ivermectin with their patients, and they've kept their patients out of the hospital, they've kept them out of the ICU. I find it's exceptionally frustrating because I keep getting criticized for raising my concerns about the vaccines and harms, and I have physicians coming at me and saying, well, if only you saw on the front lines, what happens to people who die from COVID and how terrible it is. And yes, it's awful. I feel terrible for all of them. But the other thing that I point out is it's estimated that more than half the people that have died in this pandemic would be alive today if we had accepted these early treatment strategies. That's the reality, and I've seen it with every physician who has administered this. They talk about our ICUs being overrun, but every physician that I have worked with, and I've worked with many, who have used these effective treatment strategies, they've kept their patients out of the ICU. They don't go to the ICU, they don't die. Do you realize that the way we've been treating patients is they go to the hospital, and if they aren't sick enough to go on a respirator, they typically get sent home, and it's, take fluids and some of these other, maybe some aspirin. It's basically what they like to call in medicine watchful waiting, which means we're going to do nothing, right? And you literally have to wait till you're sick enough to come in and basically be put in the ICU and put on a respirator. That's not how you treat disease, right? The earlier you intervene, the better the outcome. And we have these early treatment strategies, and I think it's no coincidence. The only one we've approved in Canada is called remdesivir. It does have it has genuine safety issues and does virtually nothing for COVID-19, but it's on patent, and there's tons of money that can be made. These other ones are dirt cheap. Ivermectin, you can treat somebody for about $1 a day. Right? And so they've been using a great effect in all these low-income countries, but in North America, we've refused to adopt these strategies. And you have to understand, and they even talk about safety issues. Well, one of the things is, so there's rare cases of safety issues associated with using the veterinary form, and that's simply because of calculation errors, trying to convert to the people making simple mathematical errors when trying to convert to the human dose. And the reality is that the ivermectin is on the list for the World Health Organization of one of the 50 most needed drugs in the entire world, has an unbelievable safety record. It's used worldwide to effectively treat all these parasitic diseases. It was approved by Health Canada in 2018 to treat exotic parasitic diseases when Canadians are traveling. And so there's absolutely no excuse. And I put the onus on. So when these physicians, my own physician, honestly criticized me, saying, I'm giving this messaging, talking about, the patients of hers that died. I respectfully pointed out that, I'm also on the front lines, and I'm trying to deal on a daily basis with people who have died from, family members of people who have died from the COVID-19 vaccines. And so I'm seeing these horrible deaths as well on the other side. And the difference to me is, had they not rejected these effective early treatment strategies, at least half of the patients that died in their practices would be alive today. So I'm sorry, I don't have a lot of patience for these physicians. And I'm just going to point out one thing as well. It's important for the general public to know. I usually don't ever criticize anybody's expertise in their particular area of work, but we're in unique times. And so I think the public needs to be aware, right? We put a lot of faith in our physicians. The average family physician knows almost nothing about immunology, and certainly about vaccines. People forget vaccinology is a subdiscipline of immunology. The average family physician in Canada, just so you know, gets between 5 and 10 lectures in their first year on immunology, of which a tiny fraction of that is going to be dealing with vaccines. They are not immunologists. They are not vaccinologists, all right? And they're ignoring the vaccinologists here in Canada. They're promoting the vaccines. The reality is they don't understand the science, and they do not have a deep enough understanding, on average, to understand the science and to understand the debates that are going on.
If information has been deliberately suppressed about these treatments, that would be a crime, seeing that people are dying.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Yep. Yes.
Now, Doctor, do you ever will we see a national debate with top scientists on this subject ever in Canada, their side for pro and our side? Do you think we'll ever see that in Canada?
I and my colleagues have been open to that for months, many months. I love to see it done. The public should be insisting on it. Right, like the old-fashioned good scientific debates. I would argue scientists can talk about the science. We can put aside our emotions. We can talk about it respectfully. I would argue what I would like to see happen is have a team. If it's too big, it gets a little unwieldy. So I'd say between 3 and 5, scientists and or physicians on who want to debate both aspects of the COVID-19 policies, and then have it moderated by somebody, and it has to be very public, and that's what I keep pointing out to the public. People who keep arguing that those of us who have legitimate concerns are wrong, that providing misinformation, that we're lying, and that we don't know what we're talking about, have to keep asking themselves why then are many of us standing there in the arena. I view it like gladiators of old, right? We're standing in the arena. We're waiting. None of their champions will step forward. None. We've tried this. We tried this in Ontario with Doug Ford. It was attempted in Alberta. It was attempted in Saskatchewan, where their premiers were also invited to have these open scientific discussions. Nobody so far, and I know I've issued invitations. Every single person who attacks me, I invite them to come on and talk publicly. I was even being interviewed once, and live in the chat, somebody was trolling the whole talk. It was interesting. The person who was interviewing me stopped and invited the person to come on. They logged off pretty quickly. And that's what we're seeing over and over again. It's remarkable. I've asked thousands of people. Not one person, not even one, in all these months has been willing to talk openly, publicly, about the science and medicine underlying COVID-19. It's exceptionally frustrating. Even my own colleagues at the University of Guelph who have attacked me, there were 83 of them who are about that number, who signed a letter to the public, naming me to the public and saying that I was lying to the public, providing misinformation. Do you realize some of these individuals were just down the hallway from me, in the same hallway, just a few doors down? Not one of them, not one of those people was ever willing to talk to me on the phone, in a Zoom meeting, or come to my office, and I have an open door policy. I'll also tell you, and I invited many of them to do so, Not one person. And then even after they signed that off saying that I was giving misinformation, I had written a scientific document to outline what the science that I've been talking about, because this was birthed from a short interview that I gave on the radio where I expressed concerns that the messenger RNA vaccines might be linked to the heart inflammation that was occurring, that they might be linked to the heart inflammation that was occurring in young people. And then I was attacked on this, so I wrote a document with all the science, because of course I was not able to deliver all of my scientific arguments in that short interview. People argue to the public, you realize he only told you half the story? And I laugh about that because I say, well, you're giving me far too much credit because I didn't even get to deliver 1% of the story, right? They're trying to mean that I didn't get to the other side of the story. No, there was so much more science, so many more mechanisms of action, of potential harm of these things. And after I wrote that document, this letter was written by my colleagues. You realize that of those who I was able to get a straight answer from, none of them had even read my science. None of them had even bothered to see what my arguments were for my position. This is what's happening right now, and the censorship is extreme. It's really unbelievable.
Now, some of your colleagues, they also said that it doesn't alter DNA. Would you care to comment on that?
Yeah, so when it comes to the DNA, there isn't sufficient data to... my personal opinion is that it's not substantially altering the DNA. All I can tell you is it was thought that human cells did not have a type of protein that's needed to convert the messenger RNA in the vaccine into DNA. It turns out we do actually have these types of proteins present. So it's theoretically possible. Personally, I would think that it's probably not a substantial issue, but theoretically possible. And since it's theoretically possible, I would argue as a scientist that it would be worthwhile investigating that and doing the research just to alleviate our concerns, people's concerns about that. That's the thing, as people ask these questions, and as you see that there's theoretical possibilities for these happening, that used to be the scientific basis for then conducting the research and definitively answering people's questions. So many of the questions that you have, I can't definitively answer because we've lost this whole concept of conducting research to address the tough questions these days. No problem.
What I find interesting with what you're saying is what I'm seeing very clearly is you're confronting a talking point, not a science. And let me illustrate what I mean by that. You ask a doctor about all this, and what's their answer if you really push them? Well, we're following the advice of XYZ. Yes. And they're following the science that we trust in, right?
Yep.
You go to the level above them, same thing.
Yeah,
you go to the level above them, same thing.
We've tried. Scientists,
I understand that. You guys will talk the science because you're working with it. The other side is purposely convoluting science from a talking point.
Yes.
I honestly wonder if they have a science. My wife and I survived.
No, at this point, I can tell you as a scientist, that's why I'm willing to debate anybody on it. They don't have the science on their side. That's very clear. And in fact, I keep pointing out, you no longer need to understand the science. You just need to understand the contradictions that are coming. Because this is the thing. The reason why people like Dr. Palmer and myself can stand up and talk off the cuff without any script here is because we're speaking the truth. We're speaking based on our knowledge, and we don't have to keep track of a story when we're speaking the truth. We don't have to make sure that what we're saying today matches what we said at last week's rally or the one before that. But the public health narrative has become so discombobulated now that they're constantly contradicting themselves. And there's so many examples that I could give you, but let's take one for example. Again, we don't have to understand the science. I encourage people now to start taking headlines from the mainstream media, which has people like myself censored. So fine, take their own messaging. Take the mainstream media's headlines from months ago and line them up side by side with headlines that they have today. So a great example is this whole issue with the vaccine mandate and the fact that, what are we telling people right now? If you have one dose of the vaccine, you're lumped in with the unvaccinated. You're dangerous. You're the same as somebody who's been unvaccinated. You're unprotected, and you're going to kill everybody else, right? We know from the very get-go that the two-dose regimen was proclaimed to have 95% effectiveness, right? But so this is the thing. So a lot of people who are accepting this current messaging about the one dose doesn't count have forgot about the one-dose summer. Remember when Trudeau was pushing and all we were hearing about was the one-dose summer? So in Canada, we, without any scientific evidence whatsoever, and the world was watching us in bewilderment and wondering what the basis was for us going from the approved 3 or 4 week interval, depending on whether it was a Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, to a 4-month interval. And if you recall, the reason why we could go for the 1 dose and not worry about getting people 2 doses is because 1 dose was, a lot of people don't realize this, you can, if you don't believe me, you can go on the Health Canada website right now and look. They will have on there that the 1 dose of the Pfizer vaccine is 95% effective. So now you have to start asking yourself, using their own messaging, if 1 dose is 95% effective and 2 doses is 95% effective, then why are the people with 1 dose being lumped in with those who are unvaccinated, right? Why was that okay then when trying to justify going to a 4-month interval, which had no scientific basis? But now those same people who are sitting with 1 dose are told, no, it's not 95% effective. It's the equivalent of being unvaccinated altogether, right? This is where we're getting to. So on that basis alone, that's what I'm saying, is it's become blatantly obvious. You don't have to understand the science. They are not following the science.
The reality
and they're
is
contradicting themselves
you're
over and over and over again.
If you really listen to their words, they actually shoot themselves in the foot all the time.
Over and over, all the
Let me
time.
give you an example. Where I'm from Kitchener-Waterloo, and we moved to Huntsville. And in Huntsville, we have counselors in a council meeting who, their language that they used about their own unvaxxed co-workers was absolutely deplorable. And they're going to be taken to account for it. But I'm aware of a situation of a 17-year-old hockey player that died from myocarditis shortly after having a second job.
Yes.
That family had that put out on the social media. In no time, the regional head doc released a statement that it in no way had anything to do with the vaccine. That's what the first heading was. And then from then on, they were saying, but we're investigating to find out what it really is, and we're working with the family. So they don't know. But they're right away out there with it's not. That should tell you something.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. There's been a remarkable number of young people who have died for no apparent reason. And in many cases, we can't confirm their vaccination status, but I've been particularly concerned about the number of varsity athletes at our universities who have been dying completely unexpectedly and suddenly. And the only thing that I can tell you, I don't know whether they were or were not vaccinated. Well, actually, I can't tell you when they were vaccinated. What I can tell you is that no varsity athlete in Ontario can participate in a varsity team without being vaccinated. They weren't allowed exemptions.
My point on that example was simply this. It's crazy. If you're following the science, that first statement that head doc released would never be said.
Yes.
You would say, we don't know.
Exactly. That's exactly. Yes.
The way they're reporting it tells
as you heard from me, yeah.
Agenda.
As you heard from me, I won't say definitively that's because of the vaccine. Right? I'm a scientist. I'm open to that possibility that there is some other underlying condition with any individual case, but there's too many of these to not investigate properly. Absolutely.
If anybody's paying attention, that whole approach should really put your guard up.
Yes.
You should realize there's something drastically wrong with public health officials who would talk with that kind of language.
Yeah, well, look at the language. So another contradiction is, so for example, at my university, our president hosted the local medical officer of health who declared the whole reason why the vaccine mandate made so much sense is that there is essentially no such thing as a breakthrough infection. And that's still being claimed by many, although their ability to claim that continues to be eroded. So, but that was the idea, is they cited like a 0.0003% breakthrough infection rate, so essentially zero, meaning you're completely protected. But then you have to ask yourself, if you're completely protected, why then, when you're in an environment, a workplace and a university where everybody's vaccinated, why can't you take off your mask and go back to life as normal? And when our president was asked about that recently, she actually created quite a furor on our campus because she completely contradicted the messaging that they had just given. Well, the reason why, of course, they still have to mask and physically distance is because, hey, it's well known that people who are vaccinated can still get infected, still get COVID, and transmit the virus. In fact, there's very good immunological reasons why people who are vaccinated can still transmit the virus. And the scientific data that is emerging is showing that they can transmit at least as efficiently as somebody who has no immunity whatsoever. And the reason is because when we put the vaccine in the shoulder, we're tricking our bodies into thinking that it's what we call a systemic infection. And you get great and so systemic. The problem with that is that where your body wants to protect the most is the blood. Because if a pathogen gets into the blood, it can disseminate throughout the whole body. And so we get all these antibodies in the blood. So the one place in our respiratory system where these antibodies will spill over into, if you're trying to protect against a systemic infection, are the lower airways. And that's because you just think about a gas exchange. There's barely a physical barrier between the alveolar space and the blood vessels to allow that ready air exchange, which also means it's very easy for a pathogen that gets deep into the lungs, so that would be what we call pneumonia, right, for that pathogen to get into the blood. So we put antibodies in the lower airways if we think we have a systemic infection. But we aren't getting proper antibody protection in the upper airways like we would if we were naturally infected. So these people have the vaccine. Yeah, remember, all the antibody titers they're showing, that's in the blood. But these people, on average, are quite poorly protected in their upper airways. And it's not the virus that's deep down the alveoli that gets transmitted to other people because of the dead airspace when we exhale. It's the viral particles that are in the upper airways. So that's why the vaccinated can spread this just as efficiently as somebody who's completely unprotected. And so these vaccines, on that basis, because they don't come close to conferring sterilizing immunity, they don't properly protect the upper respiratory tract, they only confer about 4.5 months of immunity, it's absolutely 100% impossible to achieve the goal of herd immunity with these vaccines. 100% impossible. It would be for these companies, it would be such a quick and easy and cheap study to do, and they could definitively rule this problem in or out. And whenever there's such easy to do research to be done and they won't do it, that for me is always a red flag.
Well, yeah, exactly. Why isn't that happening?
Yes. All I can say is, again, we're not being provided with accurate data. So it's hard to answer any of these questions to do with, what's actually due to COVID, what's due to other things. And how we're defining these things is crazy. Like I said, we're not even defining somebody as vaccinated until they're 14 days out from the second dose. The second dose is serving as a booster, right? And so typically the immune response would be peaking actually about 5 to 10 days after receiving that. So we're actually taking people who would theoretically be at the absolute peak of vaccine-induced immunity, and we're calling them not fully vaccinated, for example. And so people were to die in that time frame, even if it was linked to the vaccine, it'd be linked as somebody who was not fully vaccinated having died. So it's very difficult with all these kind of nuances that are going on. All I can say really is what we do know is that the problem of COVID, the number of cases, has been dramatically overestimated, but to an unknown degree because of the way we've misused the PCR test. And we know that the problems associated with the vaccines have been grossly underestimated, but to an unknown degree. And so until we have accurate numbers for these, which I can't see we're going to have it any time soon unless we completely change the way we're monitoring these things, we're not going to be able to come up with accurate assessments as scientists of, with these kind of questions. But the issue was at the beginning, or the problem was, people kept arguing that that this could have between a 1 and 10% fatality rate, infection fatality rate, meaning for every 100 people who were infected with the virus, between 1 and 10 would die. But the thing is we never knew what the proper denominator was, how many people were getting infected. We still don't know. Because again, like I mentioned, there's many of us, well, in fact, just right here, there was an individual who is gone now, but showed me his test result. He had a positive COVID test result almost a year and a half ago, and he showed me his antibody response for the spike protein is higher, way higher than the average person who's been vaccinated at the peak of their antibody response. So there's somebody who clearly acquired immunity naturally. We're not tracking these people at all because there's many cases where people have actually been infected and didn't even know it and have natural immunity. As we're running this clinical trial where we're evaluating natural acquisition of immunity, we're finding a huge number of people who never realized that they were sick have clear evidence of immunity against this virus. So that means that for those individuals, they were infected, but this was not a pathogen for them, and they recovered without developing disease. And so we have no idea, and we now know this is much more common than we accepted at the beginning, but we have no idea just how common, right? So the point is we still don't know the full extent of the denominator, but when it was updated in February, what was published at that time was that the infection fatality rate was 0.15, so not 1%, like we were being told, but 0.15%, and that was for the entire population. And if you took out those who were 70 years and older, it dropped to 0.05%. So just to put that into perspective, a bad flu season would be at 0.1%. Right? So again, you go out of the highest risk demographic, those over 70, and we're actually dealing with a problem that is less fatal than the annual flu. And especially when we start talking about children, right? We've had one infant in BC who died. We're talking about taking these vaccines down now, and the next phase to 5-year-olds, and then all the way down to 6 months of age. And when you start getting down to under 10 years of age, virtually nobody has died. And when you look at the flu, it's far more dangerous for these individuals. And if you want to look at another one, respiratory syncytial virus, which we live with, far more dangerous to young people. Again, and this is where even pregnant or breastfeeding women are being told, encouraged to get vaccinated to protect their infants. It's crazy. It's all based on this. It's easy to make people feel that infants are very fragile human beings, which in some ways they are. But when it comes to SARS coronavirus 2, this was presented today. The younger you are, the fewer receptors you express in your respiratory system that this virus can use to latch onto your cells and infect. So when you get down into the infants, they're quite resistant to infection with this virus. And that's why we haven't been seeing deaths among that population. And so it's very unusual. With any other infectious disease, you always have two peaks, the frail elderly and the very young. And it's very clear why, because the frail elderly, well, as we get older, our immunological function declines. So we, in essence, become somewhat immunosuppressed as we get older. And then on the very young side, our immune systems don't fully mature until we're 16 years old. Still some components of our immune system maturing as young teenagers. So we're dealing with less mature immune systems that aren't fully mature as we get into the youngest population. So that's why we usually see these peaks in the oldest and the youngest. But SARS coronavirus 2 is not like that. It's very unusual in the sense that, yes, infants are relatively immature in terms of their immunological functioning, but they're physically very resistant to infection with this virus. So this is all crazy to be encouraging breastfeeding women to be vaccinated to protect their infants. Their infants are already naturally protected. And as we go down and we start vaccinating 6-month-old breastfeeding infants, what we're doing is we're bypassing the natural protection they have from the virus when we inject these vaccines, where we start getting their body to manufacture the spike protein. And again, I can't emphasize enough, the spike protein is not the inert target that we were hoping it would be for the immune system. It has all kinds of biological activities in our bodies that can potentially be harmful. And what people have to understand is that the receptor that spike protein can bind to in our children and infants is expressed at the same concentration internally as in adults. And it's because that protein doesn't exist to serve as a receptor for the virus, right? It actually exists to serve basic physiological processes, such as regulating blood pressure and so on. So they're naturally protected from infection with SARS coronavirus 2, but when we put the vaccines in, they're at least as susceptible as adults to all the harms.
A very famous doctor who treated 3 of his patients with ivermectin and they survived. He is a hero for all Canadians right now, and we are so very fortunate to have him here. Dr. Nagase, we noticed that you were creating some attention in North Vancouver a couple of days ago with these stillborn babies in the hospital there. Can you tell us a little bit about the outcome of that?
From one of the local doctors in North Vancouver, Dr. Mel Bruchet. He has contacts all through Vancouver, and some doulas who work in Women and Children's Hospital, which isn't in North Vancouver, it's in Vancouver. It's one of the birthing centers for Vancouver. They had 13 stillbirths in a 24-hour period. That was what I heard. But the thing is, I've also heard a similar story out in Waterloo, Ontario. So in Waterloo, Ontario, I have a more reliable statistic that there was 86 stillbirths between January and July. And normally it's only 5 or 6 stillbirths every year. So about 1 stillbirth every 2 months is the usual rate. So to suddenly get to 86 stillbirths in 6 months, that's highly unusual. But the confirmation, the most important confirmation that we have from the Waterloo, Ontario report was that all of the 86 stillbirths were fully vaccinated.
Fully vaccinated mothers.
That's right.
So we're seeing a correlation.
We're seeing a correlation. And certainly when you see a correlation, then you have to start asking, in the water in Waterloo, is there something, is there something in the air? Is there some toxin in the food supply? But when you see the same correlation in different parts of the country, in Vancouver, and then in Waterloo, and you see an increase in stillbirths, you have to ask yourself, what is going on that is both in Waterloo, Ontario, and Vancouver, BC, that is suddenly causing an increase in stillbirths?